The top 10 whitest states in the U.S. where black people are not welcome. Black travelers, beware. This sounds like a list you'd never want to be on the wrong side of, right? But in some states, black residents and visitors don't just feel unwelcome. They feel like they've stepped into a time machine headed straight for Jim Crow light. Let's talk about places where racial demographics aren't just skewed. They're basically a monochrome painting where diversity means picking between two brands of mayonnaise. These are the states where black people face discrimination, either subtly through social exclusion or blatantly through outright racism in America. So why do some states remain almost entirely white while the rest of the country grows more diverse? And what happens when black people do try to settle in these areas? The answers are layered with historical factors, economic barriers, and modern-day inequality in the United States. From deeply rooted segregation to community dynamics that scream, "Outsiders beware," this list exposes it all. Stay tuned as we count down the top 10 white states in the U.S. where black people are not welcome. You might just rethink that road trip. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe to explore with me, and ring the notification bell for more eye-opening travel insights. Let's jump right in. Number 10. Iowa. Where the cornfields stretch for miles, the butter sculptures are an art form, and the black population makes up only about 4% of the residents. If you thought you'd find a thriving cultural melting pot nestled between rows of soybeans, well, you might want to recalibrate those expectations. Now, don't get me wrong, on paper, Iowa is a lovely place. The cost of living is reasonable, the crime rate isn't off the charts, and if you're into state fairs and fried food on a stick, you're in for a treat. But when it comes to racial diversity and inclusivity, let's just say Iowa didn't exactly get the memo. With a population that's a whopping 84% white, some black residents often find themselves feeling more like guests than neighbors, especially in the smaller, rural towns where diversity is about as common as a palm tree in Des Moines. Iowa isn't just white, it's the kind of white that makes you squint in the winter from the reflection off all the snow and Scandinavian complexions. But the real problem isn't the demographics, it's the racial disparities in law enforcement and economic opportunities. Black Iowans are 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts, and they face significant challenges in employment and homeownership. So, while Iowa's job market might be decent, the opportunities don't always reach everyone equally. And let's talk about racial bias. It's one thing to be the only black person in town, it's another to feel like everyone's low-key wondering how you got there. Many black residents report experiencing microaggressions, profiling, and outright discrimination, making certain parts of the state feel less than welcoming. If you've ever wanted to star in your own real-life version of Get Out, small-town Iowa might just be your casting call. While cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids offer a bit more diversity, venture outside the metro areas, and you might start to feel like a unicorn in a wheat field. Black Iowans often talk about being stared at, treated differently in stores, or experiencing casual racism disguised as Midwestern politeness. You know, the kind of friendliness that comes with a side of, "So what brings you to our town?" Bottom line, Iowa is a great place if you love agriculture, quiet living, and never having to worry about rush hour traffic. But if you're black, the unspoken message in some areas might feel like, you can visit, but don't get too comfortable. Number 9. West Virginia. Welcome to West Virginia, where the mountains are breathtaking, the banjos play on cue, and the black population barely cracks 4%. If you love country roads and being the only black person at Walmart, then congratulations, you found your spot. But if you're looking for a thriving, diverse community where you don't feel like an extra in Deliverance, you might want to keep scrolling. West Virginia is 92% white, making it one of the least diverse states in America. And while that statistic alone doesn't automatically mean black folks aren't welcome, let's just say that some areas in the state make it very clear that they prefer to keep things the way they've always been. Historically, the black population in West Virginia has been low, and that's not by accident. From old-school segregation practices to modern-day racial tensions, this state has made it tough for black residents to feel at home. If you're black and thinking of moving to West Virginia, here's what you need to know. Rural, conservative towns might not roll out the red carpet for you, unless that carpet leads straight back to the highway. Reports of racial bias, standoffish attitudes, and straight-up hostility are common, especially in smaller communities where diversity is about as welcome as a flat tire on a mountain road. And speaking of bias, West Virginia has had its share of racial tension. Whether it's the legacy of Confederate nostalgia or the fact that some towns still feel like they haven't left the 1950s, many black residents have reported feeling unwelcome, scrutinized, or just plain ignored. It's the kind of place where people might smile at you, but that smile doesn't always reach their eyes. Now, let's talk about the economy, because if the social scene doesn't scare you off, the job market just might. West Virginia already struggles with high poverty rates and limited opportunities, and that's for everybody. But for black residents, the situation is even worse. Black unemployment rates are higher, wages are lower, and opportunities for economic advancement are few and far between. And if you think you can escape these issues by starting your own business, good luck, because access to funding and resources is about as scarce as a Whole Foods in Appalachia. West Virginia is a stunning state with rolling hills, scenic drives, and a deep-rooted sense of tradition. But for black residents, that tradition can sometimes feel more like an unspoken strain. You can visit, but don't stay too long. While places like Charleston and Morgantown offer some diversity, venture too far into the rural back roads, and you might start feeling like you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, if you're black and thinking about West Virginia, just know this. The mountains might call, but they might not call for you. Number 8. New Hampshire. Where the state motto is, live free or die, but if you're black, sometimes it feels like the locals would prefer you choose the latter. With a 90% white population and a black population of just 2%, diversity here is about as rare as a Dunkin' Donuts free street in New England. Now, let's be real. New Hampshire isn't known for its diversity, and it's not exactly rolling out the welcome mat for black folks looking to settle down. Sure, it has scenic mountains, beautiful autumn leaves, and a weird obsession with being the first state to hold presidential primaries. But if you're black, you might find yourself on the receiving end of some not-so-subtle stares, microaggressions, or outright hostility, especially in those charming rural towns. New Hampshire is part of New England, a region historically lacking in racial diversity. Outside of a few cities, while places like Boston at least try to give the illusion of inclusion, New Hampshire doesn't even pretend. The state's small black population is concentrated in just a few towns, meaning that in many areas, you could go weeks without seeing another black person, unless, of course, it's your reflection in a store window while you're being followed by an overly suspicious cashier. New Hampshire might look peaceful from the outside, but beneath the surface, there are reports of racist incidents, harassment, and even outright intimidation. Black residents and travelers have spoken out about experiencing everything from racial slurs to being made to feel unwelcome in public spaces. And it's not just hearsay. Hate crimes in the state rose by 38% in recent years, with a significant number of those targeting racial minorities. And let's not forget the live free or die energy that some locals take a little too seriously. Many towns in New Hampshire are filled with staunch libertarians, rugged individualists, and folks who think government is the enemy, which is all fine and dandy until you realize that diversity and inclusion often get thrown out with their property tax complaints. If you're in Manchester or Nashua, you might find some sense of community as a black resident, but head into the smaller, more rural parts of the state, and it's a different story. Many black travelers and new residents report feeling uncomfortable, unwelcome, or outright ignored. It's not always outright hostility, sometimes it's just that quiet kind of racism, the one where people don't say anything to you because they don't want to talk to you in the first place. New Hampshire is beautiful, historic, and fiercely independent, but for black folks, it can also feel isolating, unwelcoming, and even unsafe in certain areas. If you're looking for a state with racial diversity, inclusive communities, and people who won't eye you like a UFO sighting, you might want to keep moving. Because while New Hampshire may be the live free or die state for black people, it sometimes feels more like live here and be uncomfortable. Number 7. Vermont. Welcome to Vermont, where the maple syrup flows, the winters are brutal, and the black population is so small you could probably fit them all in a single ski lodge. With a 93% white population and only about 1% black residents, Vermont is about as diverse as a snowstorm in February. Now, if you've ever wondered what it feels like to be a celebrity where everyone stares at you because you're the only one of your kind, then Vermont might just be your red carpet moment. Except instead of flashing cameras and autographs, you'll get side eyes in the grocery store and awkward small talk that somehow always leads to the question, so what brings you to Vermont? For a state that prides itself on being progressive and open-minded, Vermont has a surprising racial issue. There just aren't many black people here, and when you're in the extreme minority, it doesn't take much to feel out of place. Imagine walking into a room where everyone already knows each other, and you're just standing there like, oh, hi. That's Vermont for black folks. And it's not just about numbers. Vermont has had cases of black loggers and activists facing racism, proving that even if you try to make a change, some folks still aren't having it. In 2018, Kia Morris, the only black female lawmaker in the state, resigned after receiving racial threats and harassment. Because apparently, fighting for equality in Vermont comes with a side of, get out or else, energy. Now, Vermont isn't necessarily a hostile place for black people, let's be clear on that. No one's chasing you out of town with pitchforks and torches. But what you will get is that passive-aggressive New England brand of exclusion, the type where people are nice to your face but somehow still manage to make you feel like you don't belong. Black residents have reported feeling discriminated against in housing, job opportunities, and social circles. And if you think being a tourist will shield you from the cold, think again. Both the weather and the social climate might leave you feeling frozen out. If you love skiing, hiking, and Bernie Sanders, Vermont might seem like paradise. But for black residents and travelers, the reality is a little different. While some have carved out welcoming spaces in Burlington or Montpelier, venture outside these areas, and you might find yourself in a sea of flannel, Birkenstocks, and puzzled looks wondering how you ended up here. So, if you're black and considering Vermont, just be prepared for long winters, excellent dairy products, and a whole lot of, where are you from, questions. Because in Vermont, the real minority isn't just political views, it's you. Number 6. Maine. Home of Stephen King, moose sightings, and a black population so small you might mistake it for a rounding error. With 94% of its residents being white and only about 2% black, Maine is one of the whitest states in the country. If you're black and looking to relocate, just know that finding a barbershop that can do a proper fade might be harder than finding a Dunkin' Donuts that serves bad coffee. Now, let's be fair, Maine isn't the chase you out of town type of unwelcoming. It's more of the smile politely but keep you at a distance kind of place. The people here are friendly in theory, but if you're black, you might notice a certain curiosity, like, oh, wow, we don't usually see your kind around here. So what brings you to our town? Maine isn't just white, it's so white that in some towns, the only diversity you'll find is different shades of LL Bean jackets. Seriously, there are places where you could walk 5 miles, and the most color you'll see is the red on a lobster trap. That's just the reality of a state that has historically had very little racial diversity and even less cultural integration. For black people who live here, the issue isn't just racism, though there have been plenty of reports of that, especially in smaller, more rural areas where outsiders, aka anyone who isn't a third-generation Mainer, are already viewed with suspicion. Social isolation is the real kicker. Imagine walking into a room and realizing you're the diversity initiative. That's life for many black Mainers. And while bigger cities like Portland and Bangor offer some sense of community, step into the small towns and backwoods, and the welcome mat starts looking more like a "Don't tread on me" flag. Black residents have reported being followed in stores, getting weird looks at local diners, and being asked inappropriate questions that make it clear they don't blend in. Now, if you love seafood, cold weather, and being left alone, Maine might be a dream. But if you're black and looking for a thriving, diverse community, it's going to feel a bit lonely. Sure, Maine's got its charm. The rugged coastline, the picturesque lighthouses, and enough blueberries to put in everything from pancakes to beer. But for many black residents, it comes with a side of feeling like an uninvited guest at an all-white party. So, if you're black and thinking about Maine, just ask yourself, do I really want to be the only one at the potluck who doesn't put raisins in their potato salad? Because up here, that might just be your reality. Hold up for a second. If you're finding this breakdown a little too real or just straight up eye-opening, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to explore with me, and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on more hard-hitting, no-fluff travel and demographic insights. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for the rest of this list, because the places coming up, let's keep going. Number 5. South Dakota. Welcome to South Dakota, where Mount Rushmore is the biggest attraction, the bison outnumber people, and the black population barely hits 2%. That's right. If you're black and find yourself in South Dakota, you might be the diversity statistic. Now, South Dakota is known for its rolling prairies, wide open spaces, and a whole lot of nothing, and that applies to diversity too. 84% of the population is white, making this state about as racially varied as a mayonnaise sandwich on white bread. While South Dakota may be great for history buffs and nature lovers, black residents and travelers have reported feeling anything but welcome in some areas. South Dakota isn't just lacking in racial diversity, it's also got an exclusivity problem. Some black people who have moved here or visited describe feeling like they just crashed a family reunion they weren't invited to. The stares are unavoidable, the questions endless, the awkward silence when you walk into certain spaces uncomfortable at best. And let's not forget racial profiling, which has been reported by black visitors and residents alike. Imagine stopping for gas in a small town and suddenly feeling like the sheriff, the cashier, and the guy pretending to pump gas but just staring at you or all trying to figure out how you got there. Yeah, that's South Dakota for some black folks. If you think the cities in South Dakota are lacking diversity, wait until you visit the rural areas. Some of these places feel like they just discovered Wi-Fi, so don't expect them to have caught up with inclusivity and cultural awareness either. Small-town South Dakota is the kind of place where people might welcome you with a smile, but that smile comes with a subtle, don't get too comfortable, energy. And let's be honest, there are parts of South Dakota where outsiders of any kind get side-eyed, but when you add race into the mix, it can go from curiosity to cold shoulders real quick. Some black residents have spoken about struggling to find community, access culturally relevant services, or even just feel a sense of belonging. Now, to be fair, not every corner of South Dakota is hostile. If you stick to larger towns like Sioux Falls or Rapid City, you might find a few more people who don't react to your presence like they've seen a ghost. But venture too far off the beaten path, and the feeling of, you don't belong here, starts creeping in. So, if you're black and considering South Dakota, just ask yourself, do I love national parks enough to deal with feeling like the odd one out every single day? Because while the Badlands might be breathtaking, the racial climate, not so much. Number 4. North Dakota. Welcome to North Dakota, where the winters are brutal, the landscape is endless, and the racial diversity is, well, missing in action. With 87% of the population being white and only around 3% black, this state is about as racially diverse as a country music festival in the middle of a snowstorm. Now, North Dakota is famous for its oil fields, agriculture, and, not much else. But if you're black and thinking about moving here, just know that finding a diverse community will be harder than finding a mountain in Fargo. You might get lucky and find a few other black residents, but don't be surprised if you end up in a nod club, where every time you see another black person, you exchange that silent, knowing head nod that says, I see you, stay strong. North Dakota is one of the least diverse states in America, and it shows. While major cities like Fargo and Bismarck might have some pockets of diversity, venture outside of them, and you might start feeling like the only drop of ink in a snowstorm. And let's be honest, some small towns in North Dakota have a way of making outsiders feel like they just walked into a family dinner uninvited. The stares are relentless, the unspoken, what are you doing here, energy thick. It's not always outright hostility, but it's that subtle small town, we don't get a lot of people like you around here vibe that can make even the most confident person feel out of place. If you're black and trying to work or go to school in North Dakota, brace yourself, because reports of discrimination, racial bias, and microaggressions are more common than you'd think. Black workers in industries like oil and agriculture have spoken out about facing racism on the job, and black students in the state's universities have reported feeling unwelcome and even harassed in certain environments. It's the kind of place where you might be the first black person some locals have ever interacted with, which leads to some interesting conversations. You know, the kind where someone boldly asks, "So where are you really from?" Or, "Can I touch your hair?" Because apparently, cultural awareness didn't make it this far north. Now, if you love wide open spaces, harsh winters, and towns where everyone knows everyone's business, North Dakota might be for you. But for black folks looking for a welcoming, inclusive community, this state might feel colder than its 30 degrees Fahrenheit winters. Sure, some people in North Dakota are friendly in that polite Midwest way, but others aren't exactly rolling out the red carpet for diversity. If you're black and considering North Dakota, just ask yourself, do I love prairie landscapes enough to deal with feeling like an extra in a Western movie where I'm the only black character? Because in some parts of this state, that's exactly what it feels like. Number 3. Idaho. Famous for potatoes, breathtaking mountains, and a black population so small you could probably fit them all in one Boise coffee shop. With 89% of the population being white and only about 1% black, Idaho is what happens when you mix gorgeous landscapes with an uncomfortable history of not exactly being the friendliest place for minorities. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the white hood in the room. Idaho isn't just accidentally one of the whitest states in the U.S. It has a history of being a haven for white supremacist movements, most infamously, the Aryan nations in northern Idaho. While that group has been officially dismantled, the energy still lingers in certain areas, making some black residents feel like Idaho didn't exactly send out an invitation for diversity. If you're black and living in Idaho, let's just say that finding a barbershop that knows how to do a proper fade is going to be a full-time job. But beyond the inconvenience of not having a local black hair salon, many black Idahoans report feeling socially isolated or outright unwelcome. Idaho isn't just white. It's so white that some small towns might look at you the same way they'd look at someone wearing flip-flops in a snowstorm. Curious, confused, and maybe a little uncomfortable. And it's not just a small town problem. Even in cities like Boise or Coeur d'Alene, where the population is growing, some black residents have reported subtle and not so subtle racism, from side eyes at the grocery store to flat-out racial slurs from emboldened locals. While Idaho isn't as openly hostile as it used to be, let's not pretend the past doesn't matter. The state was once a recruiting hotspot for white supremacists, and even though the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake was shut down in the early 2000s, some areas still have that "you're not from around here, are you?" energy. If you're driving through certain parts of Idaho, you might want to double-check your GPS, because some places have histories of being sundown towns, meaning black people weren't safe after dark. While times have changed, the attitudes in some of these towns, not so much. Well, that depends. If you love hiking, wide open spaces, and feeling like a real-life Where's Waldo in social settings, you might be fine. But if you're looking for a strong black community, cultural diversity, and an environment where you don't feel like an extra in a documentary about isolation, Idaho might not be it. Sure, the potatoes are great, the scenery is breathtaking, and the crime rate is low. But for black residents, Idaho can feel like a long, lonely road trip with no clear destination. So, if you're thinking about moving here, just know you might be stepping into a state where some people still haven't fully embraced the concept of racial diversity. Number 2. Wyoming. Welcome to Wyoming, the least populated state in America, where cowboys still reign supreme. The sky seems endless, and the black population is so small you might need a microscope to find it. With 91% of residents being white and only around 1% black, Wyoming isn't just lacking in diversity, it's actively allergic to it. Now, let's be clear. Wyoming isn't openly hostile to black folks in the way that some places used to be, wink wink. But let's just say that if you're black and decide to move here, you're going to get noticed, a lot. Whether it's in the grocery store, at a gas station, or just minding your business at a diner, expect some curious or downright suspicious looks. Because for many small-town Wyomingites, you might be the first black person they've seen in real life. Wyoming is historically conservative, which is great if you love rugged individualism, hunting, and never having to deal with rush hour traffic. But if you're black and looking for a community that understands your experiences, you're out of luck. There just aren't many black neighborhoods, black-owned businesses, or places where you won't stick out like a sore thumb. Even in the state's biggest cities, if you can call them that, like Cheyenne and Casper, diversity is minimal. But the real fun starts when you head into the smaller, more rural areas, because that's where black visitors and residents have reported cases of discrimination and racial hostility. If you've ever wanted to know what it feels like to be an exotic zoo animal, Wyoming small towns will give you that experience for free. Stares, weird questions, and unsolicited opinions are all part of the package. And while many locals are the polite, "Howdy, how's it going?" kind of folks, some have made it clear that change and diversity is not on their to-do list. Reports of black people being treated unfairly in jobs, getting racially profiled, or feeling unwelcome in certain establishments aren't uncommon. It's not that everyone is outwardly racist, but in some places, it's more of a, "you can be here, just don't expect to feel at home" vibe. If you love wide open spaces, cowboy culture, and the idea of never waiting in line at a DMV, Wyoming has its perks. But if you're looking for a thriving, diverse community where you won't feel isolated, this might not be the best choice. Yes, the scenery is breathtaking, the cost of living is decent, and if you love hiking and horses, you'll be in paradise. But for black folks, the social climate might feel a little less welcoming than the natural one. So, if you're planning to move, just know that finding black barbershops, soul food, or a community that understands you will be about as easy as spotting a unicorn in Yellowstone. Number 1. Montana. And here we are, Montana, taking the crown as the whitest state where black folks are not exactly rolling out the welcome wagon. With 88% of the population being white and black residents making up a microscopic 0.5%, you'd have better luck finding a grizzly bear in downtown Billings than running into another black person. Now, Montana is famous for its stunning landscapes, rugged independence, and a whole lot of cowboy energy. But let's keep it real, it's also home to one of the highest per capita rates of hate group activity in the country. That's right. Some parts of this state aren't just lacking in diversity, they're actively trying to keep it that way. Montana's nickname is Big Sky Country, but when it comes to diversity, it's more like Big Nope Country. The black population here is so low you could put all the black residents in one stadium and still have enough seats left over to host a rodeo. If you're black and decide to move here, expect to be the only one in your workplace, your neighborhood, and maybe even your whole town. And it's not just about numbers. Reports of white nationalist groups and racial hostility in certain areas make it clear that some folks here aren't exactly looking for new neighbors who don't blend in with the snow. Towns like Kalispell and Whitefish have been linked to extremist activity, and while it's not everywhere, it's enough to make any black person think twice before putting down roots. Montana is all about self-reliance and wide open spaces, which sounds great until you realize that as a black person, you might end up feeling like a social island. Sure, some cities like Missoula and Bozeman are a little more progressive, but let's be honest, you won't find a thriving black community anywhere in this state. And if you thought racial bias and discrimination were limited to the Deep South, think again. Some black travelers and residents report experiencing everything from cold stares to outright harassment. And let's not even talk about the racial profiling that can make you feel like you're being watched more closely than a suspicious package at the airport. Listen, Montana is breathtakingly beautiful. If all you're looking for is mountains, rivers, and enough space to scream into the void without anyone hearing you, this is the place. But if you're black and want to live somewhere you don't feel like a guest at an all-white dinner party every single day, Montana probably isn't the move. And with that, we wrap up our list of the top 10 white states in the US where black people are not welcome. What do you think? Have you had experiences in any of these states? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and make sure to subscribe to explore with me for more real, unfiltered travel and demographic insights. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and choose your destinations wisely.